Welcome back. We are bringing out our next panel, the long-awaited, and similar to earlier, this will be in the smart brevity format. So please join me in welcoming our moderator, the chair of NCEW, Heather Reams, for the permitting reform panel.
Hey there, everybody. It's great to be with you. If you know me, you know I like to sit on the orange couch, so I'm giving it up for my wonderful panelists. As Angela said, we're going to be doing this in a smart brevity format, so each panelist will have an opportunity to answer similar questions about their challenges in dealing with permitting. So to that, I'd like to invite my first guest, and please join me in giving a warm welcome to Jean Grace, Senior Vice President and General Counsel of American Clean Power Association. Welcome. Do you feel like you're on the Heather Reams show?
I do.
Yeah.
Sorry to steal your orange couch.
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah, it's okay. I share. Yeah. It should be on.
Nope.
No? One more time.
I think it's working now.
Hey, you got
that's
it.
a little working too much.
You got it. So, I'm sure a lot of people know ACP, but I'd love to, introduce yourself, introduce the organization, and then we'll get into why permitting reform is important to you.
Sure, and thanks, and good to be here with you all today. I think you already kind of did introduce me, but Jean Grace, General Counsel and Senior Vice President at American Clean Power Association. For those of you who don't know, ACP is one of the leading voices in the clean energy industry, kind of covering all the facets of clean energy. So wind, solar, transmission, storage, you name it, we cover it, and we have, obviously developers, manufacturers, and pretty much anybody else involved in the clean energy sector.
And then permitting, what areas of permitting is your organization most interested in?
So with respect to permitting, I think it's obviously, for this panel, federal permitting. Obviously, state permitting plays a huge part as well, because for generation, you're at the state level. But it's really federal permitting and getting some, especially in light of what's going on with the administration currently. There's been repeated executive actions that have targeted wind and solar, which make it very hard to get a wind and solar permit if there's any type of federal nexus. So I think that, and with respect to kind of even considering comprehensive permitting reform, it doesn't do a lot to speed up the process if at the end of the day there is no permit that you can get. So obviously it's really, we need some type of, to address that issue first and make sure the administration, the bans that they've essentially put on with respect to federal permitting for wind and solar are lifted. And then I think it's really a debate about how best to engage in processing for all energy resources, including clean energy.
I know that's a uniqueness, and particularly dealing with wind and solar in the administration. Prior to that, and ACP's been supportive of a permitting package for some time. How about some of the bottlenecks that you've been experiencing?
Sure. I guess, I just touched on one big one, and I think this is one that's specific to renewable energy. I think the other bottlenecks are kind of tech neutral. But the big bottleneck for us now is obviously the executive actions that are hold up federal permits, because again, you can't get an EGLE permit. You're out there and you have a wind turbine, you're subject to potential prosecution. You can't get immunity, and there's actions like at the Department of Interior for every type of review or any type of authorization. There's 3 levels of reviews, including having the Secretary of Interior sign off of it. And I mean, for instance, in environmental impact statements, about 3,000 pages, you can imagine Doug Burgum's probably not reading those, and getting his attention to get him to sign off on it is pretty difficult. So I think that's number one, because that essentially stops clearly any projects that are on public lands and public waters, because they need federal permits. But I think one thing people don't realize is even if you're on private lands, that impacts you as well. Because you're typically, even though your construction permit's going to come from the state or municipality, you're still going to need a federal permit again for ancillary permits, clean water, Army Corps, and so forth. So if you need one of those, you can't get it right now, and your project's kind of at a standstill. So it is impacting projects on private lands as well. So I think that's the number one issue. I think number two would be assuming we can tackle and get those executive actions reversed so that clean energy has the same shake to get permits as other technologies. I think number two would be kind of timeliness, getting permits issued in a timely manner. And I think so far, the Fiscal Responsibility Act, for instance, they did touch upon and put timelines on the NEPA process. But the NEPA process is only a small part of the permitting process. And you see agencies that don't initiate the NEPA process, and then even when you're done the NEPA process, they don't ultimately issue, say, the record of decision or the right-of-way. So you still need to kind of have, from start to finish, kind of a permitting timeline across the continuum. So that's a real barrier, I think. And then I think the third one is even once you have permits and you're fully permitted, you're subject to litigation. And in light of the Corner Post decision that was issued by the Supreme Court, essentially you can get an APA challenge, an Administrative Procedure Act challenge, which is typically how these are challenged for being arbitrary and capricious, and NEPA. And you can really get that at any point in time. So if you want certainty for a project, you're fully permitted, at some point there has to be some type of reasonable limitation on kind of that specter of litigation just to make sure. And obviously it has to be a reasonable amount of time. And then I think the other one is transmission. Transmission is really the big issue for the clean energy industry. When you have about 2,000 gigawatts in the queues, the interconnection queues, but without some type of transmission to deliver those are, a lot of those will never make it to fruition. So I think it's interregional transmission in particular. The regions have done a fairly good job within the regions of building transmission, but there really isn't that interregional transmission. And NERC did a report that we need about 35 gigawatts to make sure we can meet our reliability and energy security needs. And they were looking at only at the interregional level. So really getting that built, and currently there isn't a workable process to get interregional transmission built.
I'm going to go to the timeline piece. Last year, I actually testified before the Natural Resources Committee, and almost every, at least Republican member, was asking about timelines, and to the minority witness, and it didn't seem like there was any consensus on timelines for that, dealing with the permitting process and timelines, the smaller pieces of it, or even in litigation as well. Do you think there's a starting place that we're starting to see, or something that, who's putting a marker down?
Yeah, I think it's pretty objective that, for instance, just to give a way of example on timelines, I started working in the wind energy sector in 2008, and my first meeting was actually with SunZia, which was the largest clean energy infrastructure project to date in the Southwest, a large transmission line, obviously. And it took 15 years to develop, and they through four presidencies. And it wasn't just because I wasn't very efficient at getting it moved forward, but just the permitting process takes that long, and that's not atypical of all transmission lines have kind of the same experience. And I think there's general agreement, say for transmission, you're in the 7 to 10 year period. For generation, you're looking at about 4 years. So I think there's an agreement that clearly the process takes way too long, especially with rising demand, and if you need to increase energy output by 15% by 2035, and it takes 15 years to get a transmission project, that's well after it. So we really can't meet kind of our, the crisis of our time is really meeting the energy demand reliably and affordably. And if you can't get these projects and timelines. So again, I think we're thinking that with respect to timelines, again, there's the timelines on the NEPA process, but it makes sense to put a timeline on the front end and on the back end, so the full permitting process. And I think we also think this makes sense, too, because in the current situation, clean energy is not necessarily the favored child at the administration. So if you have these kind of objective milestones that an administration has to meet, if the winds change and you're an oil and gas project in a subsequent administration, at least you have these objective milestones an administration would have to meet. So I think that's something we're considering with respect to some type of comprehensive permit reform.
Fantastic. Do you, I guess a follow-up question to that, because you bring up a good point. Do you think that there is any appetite in Congress to treat energy projects differently based on permitting? Or do you
I think people recognize, especially in light of the Energy Permitting Reform Act, which came pretty close to passing, you need 60 votes to pass any kind of comprehensive reform. So at this point, obviously, the Republicans are on the ascendancy, but to get to 60 votes, you need to bring on Democrats.
Right.
So I think most people are considering a tech-neutral approach, and I think that's how we're thinking of it as well. And the only place we really see that differently is at the administration currently. I think everyone truly believes that to meet the rising energy demand, you need all the energy resources, and we shouldn't be holding any back. So, and I think Congress does get that, and there's bipartisan support for doing something comprehensive that is on a tech-neutral basis.
Excellent. Last year, ACP CEO Jason Grimet, who's, I think many of us know, is terrific, and he did a wonderful job testifying on permitting last year, laying out some of the pieces. Have there been any adjustments that you're looking at between last year and this year, lessons learned? Of course, we've been talking about the administration and how they've been leaning in. Are there other areas that now, since he was front and center, I thought, again, he did a fantastic job, that you're ensuring that you're going to be advocating for, you're ranking things? You laid them out well, but...
Yeah, I think it's tech neutral too,
Yeah.
and I think his testimony really was saying that, hey, to recognize kind of the economic and energy security issues of the day, and he testified in 2023, we need a tech neutral approach, and I think doubling down now, and in 2023, we didn't really, the AI data center is really, the demand is really, so I think it's even become more of an imperative to get all energy resources to, and so again, I think some of the areas that we're looking at is making sure that there are those milestones across the permitting process, but also what we've also experienced with the administration is fully permitted projects getting their permits revoked. And I think that's something that also needs to be addressed. If you really want to have financing and certainty to really build the development you need to meet, the energy demand of today and tomorrow, you need that kind of long-term certainty. So there's not this kind of whipsaw effect or ping pong in one administration. And so I think that's another thing. Having some type of just compensation if a permit is revoked would make sense, and I think that would serve across the tech neutral way. In that way, regardless of what technologies that are out of favor in any particular administration, there is some type of recourse if they're a fully permitted project. And I think the real need for that is to make sure there's investment certainty from the financing sector, because it's harder to finance when you go through the entire firmly permitted process, and you look at some of the offshore wind projects, for instance, $4 billion, $5 billion, and you already passed and gone through all the hurdles, and suddenly to have for what so far has really not been anything more than an arbitrary reason to have your permit revoked does not help the financing community.
At all. Well, that are all my questions. I tell you, I could sit up here and ask you a bunch more questions. You're very knowledgeable. So thank you so much, Gene, for joining us. Join me in thanking him on our first Smart Brevity. Okay. This is great. Up next, ladies and gentlemen, up next. Hello, Cliff. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome to the Orange Couch. Cliff, you are the CEO of Avantus. Tell us about you and Avantus.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So I've been the CEO for about a year of the company. Just kind of real quick about why I came into the industry and why I'm here. 100 years in coal, my family. They ended up getting out of coal in 2010, so I'm the most popular person at the dinner table. And I also spent 4 tours in Iraq. And so when I got out in 2008, this was kind of the only way to do U.S. energy because fracking hadn't occurred yet. So I came into the industry in a way to try to figure out how we use our energy here. Our core belief as a company is that the economy needs cheap energy and cheap electrons, both for safety and for geopolitical power across the world. We talk about things like we're building the next Hoover Dam. We operate only in the desert Southwest. We do large projects, 1,000+ megawatts, right? And so you think around what we're doing is really just creating the new Hoover Dam. We're using sun for water, and we're using batteries for Lake Mead, and we think it makes a lot of sense in that marketplace. There's a real value, if you look at our history as a country, that we built BPA, Bonneville Power Administration. That was renewable. Built a lot of aerospace planes during World War II. We did a lot of uranium during the Cold War. Same thing with Tennessee Valley Authority, right? This is just the next step in using our natural resources in an area that doesn't have a lot of resources to create energy. So that's what we do, is we build dispatchable, large-scale projects in the desert Southwest. We focus on the Reno area quite a bit for the data centers, Arizona obviously for the data centers as well too. And really right now, the real conversation is affordability. We're really trying to figure out how to get affordability for ratepayers and for off-takers. We're owned by KKR and EIG. As you guys know, they have put billions of dollars in gas and oil. They actually see us as a complement to that if you keep usage lower in the U.S., you can actually export more through LNG for geopolitical. So that's kind of how they think through this. And so, what we do is we just build large-scale projects. For instance, one of the ones we're doing now is 1.5 gigawatts, which is the derated capacity of Hoover Dam right now. So that is our story and who we are.
Fantastic. So we're here on a permitting panel. If you're building big projects, it sounds like you have maybe some big headaches dealing with permitting. Is that fair to say?
It's permitting's always been a challenge. I've been in the industry a long time, and the nice thing is we have a lot of demand right now, right? And so I'd rather have a lot of demand and harder permitting challenges and no demand.
And easy permitting, right?
Challenges, right? But that's where we're at.
And then some of your priorities that you, as you're doing these projects that you have in permitting, anything? Is there you have a top 5?
Yeah, I think the permitting challenges, we've got all the things we've talked about before. We need to have staffing. We need to have timelines. We need to know when it's going to occur, right? And I would say the one big thing on being able to do the permits quickly, efficiently, and so forth is the quicker we get electrons on, affordability is better, but it's also domestic manufacturing. Because if you can know exactly when you're going to get your permits and when the outcome is going to be, we can go by supply chain. And so we buy a lot of American equipment. And so I think permitting challenges allow us to build out our industrialization and reshoring.
And then let's go to bottlenecks, because you started talking about, supply chains there too. So I'm thinking about some of the bottlenecks that you've been experiencing and how permitting reform can solve some of those specifically in your programs.
Yeah, as you guys know, the EO, the executive order, says everything must go through the secretary's offices now, right? And so that's been something we've been, actually while we're in D.C., is trying to understand what that process could look like.
Eyes on the what are you doing, Secretary, when you say you need to review this, right?
Yeah,
Understanding
exactly.
that, right?
I think they're looking for the field offices to really drive why this makes the most sense for that area, right? And so what we see there is U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services getting take permits has been a big thing we've been working on for actually operational permits, right? Right away for transmission has been another thing we've worked on quite a bit for our gen-ties and also for new sources of energy as well too, whether it's gas. We need a lot more transmission in this country, right? And again, as far reaching on the manufacturing side, we have seen it being different by different states and different field offices. And so we had one state like Arizona who said, we're waiting for guidance. We asked about that, said there's no new guidance coming out. You should just be putting things in. So we're trying to figure out what the new process is. It's been a huge shift. I think we'll figure it out and move forward, but I think getting consistency among all the field offices is going to be a large part of driving.
So these are federal field offices, we're not dealing with states. This is the federal field offices, and maybe getting different answers from that. So coordination is even something. I'm going to say it's so basic, it's so much, and needing to make sure that's shored up.
And what we're seeing is because of the uncertainty, right? We're having a bankruptcy a month for U.S. manufacturers, right? We've lost over 8,000 manufacturing jobs, $10 billion in investment, right? And so even one of the factories we're looking at, we're worried about. But these are states like Arizona, Georgia, South Carolina, Kentucky, right? All getting impacted by not having the manufacturing facilities there. And so you're also seeing an increase of rates by 5% this year, and it's hitting consumers. And so we see hitting the mom and pops manufacturers and suppliers more than it does the large companies. And as we know, 2/3 of our economy is based on consumer spending. But 40% of the S&P 500 is based on tech companies.
Right.
So we got to bridge that gap, and it means affordability is key. We need to keep the old economy running, consumer spending, GDP. Well, we got to fuel the AI, right? And the common bridge between that is cheap, abundant energy. And so we've had this argument around cheap and being able to be resilient, and I want both, right? And
Not
so
either or.
if you think around, what Excel was doing years ago in the forefront of this, when they did the procurements, they were calling it steel for fuel. And so they would build a large gas generation, right? And then they would buy the cheaper renewables so it would reduce their burn. And so they were able to have the best of both worlds. That's what we should be doing as industries and as we should be figuring out how to do both, cheap and reliable. And again, the less we burn, the more we can export through LNG, the more power we have globally as a country. So that's the angle I come from is let's stop the bickering and work together and figure out how to do this going forward to get the best thing to drive America's old economy and new economy.
Oh, I love it. It's a lot of common sense packed in there. You mentioned the EOs and, of course, some of just the process of the EOs and what that process is, different field offices. Are there specific EOs that have hit your company either hard or have changed the way you're doing business?
So I don't think it even really changed the way. It's the uncertainty, right? And so whether it's tariffs or an EO or permitting, really what we're trying to do is we have a time between when we sign a contract to the time we deliver power. And whatever we know is there, we basically pass off to the consumers, right? And so whatever the rules are, we can live with. Just set them and leave them and let's move on. And if we had tariffs under the last administration, right? And so we were always trying to figure that out. So I don't see anything changing it. It's the rapidness and how quickly it's happening is what's hard. And so I would just say if we could figure out how to set the policy and leave it alone would be way better for us as an industry.
Do you think that what you're prescribing sounds like a lot of common sense? Do companies like yours, would it scale? Would it grow? Would it perform better? Would you be able to do more? Or where do you think the efficiencies are?
Yeah, for us, I think you look at Nevada as a great state, right? 80% of Nevada, over 70 million acres, is federal land. Out of that, 20%'s already been designated for solar. Let's use that land. If anyone's driven between Reno, Barstow, Daggett, and Phoenix.
Yeah, I have.
Not a lot of other, it's probably take a whole day to do it. There's not a lot of other uses for this land, right, other than cheap dispatchable electrons for these data centers. And there's something like 5 gigs of new data centers that want to plant their flag in Reno. Mm-hmm. That's a common sense of we could do more there, right? But again, it does going to take transmission. And I think that's something we can all agree on, that we need to figure it out. And you think around the other technologies, and they all have issues. I've worked for companies that did nuclear, actually developed nuclear. It almost bankrupted them on one facility. I've worked for companies that did gas, right? You got to go find all these different parts for these, right? You got to find the spur, available transmission, and water. And you think around the desert Southwest, 70% of the water being used off the Colorado for Arizona is for agriculture. It's a $30 billion industry, right? We should be using the resources wisely there. And so if you get transmission, as you're thinking around gas plants, for instance, or even solar, we have the luxury as solar, we can go anywhere and scale. So if there's 100 megawatts of free transmission, sun shines everywhere on Earth, right? We can go use that 100 megawatts of transmission. You want to build a combined cycle this very large, you got to have the transmission, the water, and the pipeline there. And so we all need to do that because the more of that we do, the more we have stability for our source of energy to firm us, and they have the ability to get bigger projects online. So we actually work with each other to create more business for everybody.
And in the bit of time we have here, and this has really been wonderful conversation, this kind of general question, but a magic wand, you could wave it. What do you, and you're going to be, talking to members of Congress, you're here in Washington, you're talking to them. What are you, I don't think pleading for, but what are your top priorities? Yeah,
so our country's a big country. One size doesn't fit all. So let's look at regional of what makes the most sense in each region, right? And so for me in the desert Southwest, it's low conflict. Let's drive that as much as possible so we can move the country forward. I think clear, consistent timelines, definitions of all federal agencies. I think unlocking the U.S. supply chain through that is great, so we have more supply chain. One thing with the OBB is everything's getting pulled to the left. So there's a huge spike in demand for equipment, for EPCs and so forth, right? It can't be fulfilled. So I think this helps it. I think the proper staffing, I think having consistency among the field agents of what they're moving forward. And I think holding us accountable. If you're delayed and can't build, move out of the way. Let's move on and get those agencies and those people onto the right projects that are going to move forward. They're capitalized, they're right usage, they can get done. And so, in general, I think that's what I would spend time on is certainty, speed, and stop the weaponization of permits for both industries, both conventional and for renewables.
And no time like the present. Like you said, if you're involved in the AI pieces in AI and knowing how rapidly that's expanding, in the last couple of years, it's just incredible. I was in Reno last year. I didn't recognize the city. I hadn't been there in maybe 6 years. It's booming.
Yeah, and I mean, they're starting to get pushback, right? So one in Tucson was denied a permit because of their concern on energy prices going up and lack of water. I have a friend that's actually building a 1.2 gigawatt hyperscaler right now, and they're moving at a speed that he said, I've never done it in my 30 years.
Wow.
So, we're trying to get there, and I think the only way you can do it, I think if you look at, some people have said, China's building a bunch of solar because they don't have any other resources. They're building almost 740 megawatts a day of solar. Wow. We're at 136. Like, why are we fighting with one hand behind our back? Like, let's just go and win this fight, because that's what we do as America.
Nice. Well, Cliff, thank you so much. Join me in thanking him and his wonderful insights. Thank you. Thank you. Christina. Hi. Got a microphone there? Welcome to the Orange Couch.
Thank you.
I know, right? Should try it again.
Oh,
Let's see.
how about that?
Mm,
How about that?
mm.
How about that? I'm gonna shout.
I know.
Twist and shout, is that
Yep.
the song?
Right, better be. There we go. All right. I know, sometimes. All right.
Thanks so much for having me. This is so great.
Thank you for being here. And like I said, welcome to the Orange Couch. I'm Heather Reams, and I'm your host. Tell me about you and your organization. Tell the audience. Yes.
Absolutely. Hi, my name is Christina Hayes, and I'm with Americans for a Clean Energy Grid. I almost feel like I should start with an apology. I'm a lawyer, so I'm sorry if I devolve into lawyer speak at some point. I've been an energy lawyer for longer than I care to count, but I was with a state PUC, I was at FERC, done a lot of public service, also worked with the utility here in town before leading ACEG for the last 3 years. I'm really glad that Cliff broke the ice in terms of talking about military service and believing in the public interest and how that really kind of motivates our work. I was thinking about this panel, or this conversation, and kind of why I got into this. I had one of those fathers that served overseas when not everybody did, and I said, why'd you do it? And he said, well, live in the greatest country in the world. What are you going to do about it?
Yeah.
And so thinking about that and then kind of taking that mission over to ACEG, we're a diverse coalition. We have...
And ACEG stands for?
Americans for a Clean Energy Grid.
Boom. Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
Sometimes people go with the KEG. I can appreciate that. So we have nonprofits, big customers, labor, utilities, developers of all kinds, all committed to high-capacity transmission as the most cost-effective and reliable way to build out the grid. So often we get stuck in our silos, whether it be our little islands focused on our footprint here, our footprint there, or even looking at regulatory versus legislative solutions. We seek to break those down so we can have the big build-out that we need for energy dominance.
So you've gotten all of these organizations agreeing on a set of principles. Is that what I'm hearing?
Broadly, absolutely, that we should broadly connect to the various footprints that are out there, because I don't know if you've ever been to it. Have you been to an island?
Yeah, a few.
Yeah, it's kind of expensive,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
We forgot our toothpaste when we went to an island for Christmas last year. My kids are like, why is toothpaste so expensive?
Yeah.
Well, it's when you do everything in one place, or you have to import it only by a thin thread, it's incredibly expensive. And so being able to import and export and share resources more broadly, it really brings the cost down for everyone. So when we think about transmission and some of the challenges of building regionally and interregionally, we think about the 3 Ps, right? Planning, so the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has an order out there. Regions on their own, even outside of federal directives, are looking at regional collaboration on transmission planning. But then certainly paying and permitting are huge issues.
So what kind of areas in permitting? We've been hearing each of my guests up here talking about the specific areas that they have. we're thinking about transmission and permitting. First of all, I think they always go together. But like, what specifically and how do they go together? And how can permitting reform help?
And thank you so much for having the conversation in this way or sequentially, because I think I'm going to start with ditto to everything Cliff just said.
Okay.
But let's take it a next step further. So often when we talk about siting and permitting of resources, generation resources, that's single site. And so we had the conversation of let's do this in a brownfield, or let's do this on an existing area that's been used before. And that's a little harder to do with transmission, where it can stretch hundreds of miles. And so it's harder to string those pearls together. There's the 600-mile rule. Somebody once explained it to me that if you go to Vegas and take a bet that the weather is different 600 miles away from where you are, you will win every time. And so we talk about building a grid bigger than the weather. That's really what they're talking about. So those long lines can be difficult to do through brownfield, which I know is so often a focus of siting and permitting reform. So really taking the jurisdiction that we talked about with natural gas pipelines. So for multi-state lines that are high capacity, 345 kV and up, so really big lines.
Yeah.
It'd be really helpful to have that, single point of accountability at the federal level, because all the frustrating things you hear about with generation development, take that times two. If you have to get federal permission, then also state permission, and then sometimes often local permissions.
And let me guess, they're not coordinated either.
Oh, not at all. Not a chance. And so having that single agency to tie it all together the way it happens for natural gas pipelines, as well as a lot of the reforms that others have been talking about, we've seen in the SPEED Act and others, would be super helpful.
I think we're talking about the SPEED Act this evening with Chairman Westerman and Mr. Golden. So
Great.
we'll hear and see what the forecast is for moving that forward, speaking of speed. So we were talking about these efficiencies in a single point. I assume we're also talking about efficiencies in time, consumer costs come down when you're getting these kind of efficiencies. Is that fair to say?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Now you're going to make me get out my glasses and look at my notes. I got notes on this.
Okay, yeah. Well, affordability is such a big part, I think,
it
of
is.
the energy discussions now. Not only the demand for it, but also it's got to be affordable. So just thinking about if permitting can bring those prices down, why not?
Absolutely. Jim Connaughton, I don't know if you've heard him talk. He talks about for every time there's a delay in permitting, for every 4-year delay, it results in double the cost of a transmission line. And these lines aren't cheap, right? So they're, say, $500 million at a time, but now double that. And
That's significant.
Significant,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So we're looking at significant costs going forward. We have an aging grid. It just doesn't make sense to build new resources islanded. And rather, let's take that new investment and put it into the grid broadly so we can upgrade it for the broader community. I also want to point out that we're building barely just in time. Looking at some of the comparisons, folks were noting the difference between how the United States build out and how China builds out.
Okay.
Land area is almost exactly the same.
Okay.
Their grid is 2.5 times the size of ours. We complain about putting $25 billion a year into transmission. They put in $85 billion a year. We look at building high-capacity transmission. We're happy if we can get a 500 kV line. They're building ultra-high voltage. That's 1,000 kV. They have 40 such lines. They have 40 such lines, something like 30,000 miles. The United States has 0.
Okay, and what does that mean? I mean, the comparison means they're doing better than we are in building these out. Then what? So that means what?
That means that we are not able to. Okay, well, so let's talk about that.
Right.
It's not just that it's more expensive for customers, it's that new customers won't be able to site in the United States. It's not just that the power won't go out. We have a strong reliability governance mechanism in the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC, and their rules simply will not allow new customers to interconnect with the system if it will cause reliability concerns onto the system. And so those are customers that won't be able to engage in new manufacturing, site data centers in the United States. Those are customers we're losing out on entirely.
So they'd go to China, they'd go other places where.
Go anywhere else, yes.
Yeah, it's a competitiveness issue for sure then, if they're building that fast and that much. And the cost as well. And are their costs as low? Are they keeping their costs down? So if we were building this fast, our costs were different, would we be attracting people, entities back to the United States because of cost, or is it comparable? Do you know?
I'm not sure the apples to apples,
Yeah.
but I'm glad you keep bringing up affordability. That's absolutely right. And so thinking about whether it's existing generation or new generation, you want to be able to make the most of that.
Right.
And so instead of trying to line up megawatt for megawatt, a generator with a customer, it's so much more cost effective to be able to dispatch those megawatts to where they're needed most. And so that those customers, if there's a glitch with the generator, if there's an outage for any particular reason, they're able to import power from other places.
Efficiency, too. Okay. So I have this question on like impact of transmission. So really we're talking about a global competitiveness. Now we're here in the United States. Our lights come on. If we're not building out transmission beyond the global competitiveness,
Yes.
what does that mean for us? What do we get? What don't we get?
Unfortunately, Winter Storm Uri continues to be the best and the worst example,
Yeah.
right? And so thinking about Texas, ERCOT is almost entirely islanded from transmission for jurisdictional purposes. Going back to permitting reform, frankly, there are a couple of little wording tweaks that would make that way easier, just saying.
Okay.
But by being islanded during Winter Storm Uri, they were only able to import 800 megawatts, and they had 3 days of outages with the consequences that we've all heard about. We've heard about the economic damages and the hundreds of deaths that were associated with that storm, in stark contrast to the Plains and the Midwest, which were able to import 13,000 megawatts from PJM. Transmission lines, more than 400 lines between MISO and PJM, typically used to bring resources from the Midwest to the East. Here it served as a great insurance product to be able to wheel power west, and no outage lasts for more than 3 hours. And so by having those rotating outages, I'm not sure food spoils in that amount of time.
Right. Just basic everyday type of things as well. And then, we're talking also about a tremendous amount of wind and solar that's coming onto the grid. We have had the IRA, it continues, there's tax credits, continued there's demand, we're being built. Assuming that all of this needs more transmission, is that what we need? Why we need more transmission? And then permitting is going to help get from A to B much faster, right? So when you said you blessed what everyone was saying, amen.
Yes.
So you're yes, because we need to move as fast as we can.
Absolutely. I get PTSD whenever folks talk about the IRA, I'll be honest.
Okay. Well.
Because there was a transmission tax credit in Build Back Better until that was moved to IRA. So having that transmission tax credit would have been so important to help with the cost. It's such a big upfront investment that addressing that is so important. So when we look at permitting reform, I know that there are a lot of kind of different versions of permitting reform. The Manchin-Barrasso bill a couple of years ago looked at different ways to address the paying issue in terms of, kind of reaffirming what FERC has always done, which is if you benefit from the transmission, you should also bear a share of the costs. That's part of that insurance piece that we were just talking about.
I know that's controversial as well, too, and how that looks like. Every time I ask, what's the perfect solution, everyone says, it depends on who you talk to.
Depends on who you ask. I'm a FERC nerd, and so
Okay.
I'll be honest, if you want to sit down with a green eye shade, I'd be happy to go through the Federal Power Act and talk about why it should not be scary, because it really is something the Commission's been doing for decades. An additional piece on permitting reform is really looking at making sure that the jurisdiction applies end-to-end for high-capacity, regionally significant, national interest transmission. So rather than having states with the ability to block lines that have that big impact, making sure that they really are subject to that national jurisdiction so they can benefit from all of these other permitting reforms.
And making our country stronger.
Absolutely.
Fantastic.
And one other idea I would throw out, just because, and I have 48 seconds.
Yes.
One other idea. So I appreciate that this administration is really focused on a strong hand in ensuring energy dominance. This is the kind of thing that does not benefit from the pendulum swinging so far and so fast, as so many other things have not. And so if you wanted to have the big build out, like they have in China, like they have in other places, you'd have to start now to make sure that you could start putting shovels in the ground, say about Labor Day 2028. build out, plan out what the lines should look like to meet data center needs, to meet the generation that's out there, start identifying the lines. A lot of them are already on the books, and then start permitting and start determining how to pay for them in order to get that big build out that we need to keep costs down but maximize power.
Fantastic. Christina, thank you. Join me in thanking her and her wisdom and sharing that with us. Thank you. Wonderful. Rich Powell, my friend Rich Powell. You got the Eye of the Tiger song?
I feel pretty good about that.
I love the Eye of the Tiger. Maybe I can get that sometime. Well, pick one.
How about that?
Whoa.
How about that? That? Okay, we'll start.
Maybe you should move that one. Maybe it's too close to you.
This?
Yeah,
Ooh, that
that.
actually is maybe.
Yeah.
Let's go with that.
Yeah.
Does that feel
You
good?
like this
All right,
one?
let's
All
do
right.
that. Okay.
The audience, crowd pleaser
Acclaim.
there.
Acclaim.
Okay,
That's
right.
great. Yeah.
All right. Well, I did say your name, Rich Powell. Tell us about you and CEBA.
Well, most famously, I'm a friend of Heather Reams,
Right.
I think.
Yes.
So I'm Rich Powell. I'm the CEO of the Clean Energy Buyers Association and our sister institute. We're the trade association that represents the corporate energy buying community. So we have about 400 members. Of those, 200 are electricity buyers, and they are the largest buyers of electricity in the United States and increasingly around the world. And collectively, our members work together to drive low-cost, reliable, carbon emissions-free energy systems globally. We buy it all. We buy wind and nuclear. We buy solar and hydro. We buy geothermal. We buy fossil fuels and other thermal energy sources with carbon capture. We buy it all. If it's carbon emissions free, we like it. And we also use our collective voice to advocate in the policy space. Collectively, just to give you a sense of scale, our members have bought, as of Q2 this year, more than 120 gigawatts of carbon emissions-free electricity in the United States alone, and more than 250 gigawatts globally. So that would make us by far the largest state. So Texas looks small compared to the capacity we've contracted for online. And we're north of Italy and Indonesia in terms of countries.
Fantastic. And the member companies want low emissions, low carbon energy because that's a priority of the company.
It's a priority for the company, for their investors, for their shareholders, for their employees, for their business models, and often because their customers are demanding it of them.
Okay.
So we, for example, we represent or we have as our members all of the hyperscale data center operators, and they all have very strong commitments to buying carbon emissions-free electricity. They have various goals. Some of them say 100% clean or net zero or 24/7 clean energy, and they're very serious about meeting those. They're also very serious about their supply chain partners meeting goals like that. So if you're building a data center, that's a lot of steel. And it's a lot of chips. And so you tell your steel vendor who's going to put all the racking into the data center, by the way, I need you to manufacture that steel with 100% clean electricity. And you tell the same thing to your chip manufacturers, and then you start to have real impact as you then expand out that practice of buying carbon emissions-free energy, both across the United States, and then what's really cool is you expand that out to the rest of the world. And you start to tell your supply chain in Korea and Japan and Vietnam and India, by the way, you also need to buy clean electricity here.
It's so fantastic. And I'll have one more plug here. It's also all voluntary, right? For these companies.
Yeah, it's all voluntary.
These are companies setting out their goals, right? So.
And to be really clear, that 120 gigawatts I mentioned, that's all got it. Because I'm also happy to be bumped by Congressman Scott Peters, who's an amazing person, an amazing policymaker. Very glad he's here. He's a real champion on these issues, and we're very thankful for his leadership on this, especially among Democratic policymakers, where many of the things that we've been talking about have been a more complex conversation. But just to be really clear, the 120 gigawatts is all what we call additional. So that's all voluntary. That's all above and beyond what any state or, in the global context, what any country is requiring. These are all additional clean projects and deals brought on top of that.
Appreciate you clarifying that, because I didn't know how many people were familiar with the program, and I think it's game changing. So we're here about permitting reform too. So big buyers care about big changes in permitting, so tell us where your priorities are for your members.
We do. So our mission, again, is low-cost, reliable, carbon emissions-free electricity, and we need it fast.
Yeah.
So our members, the biggest buyers of electricity in the country right now, are all locked in a very intense competition to bring on artificial general intelligence as quickly as possible, and ideally to do it at least several months before their competitors in China, because it is not clear if you lose that race, if you can ever make that race back up. So days matter, months matter. And in many cases, our members are hearing from our friends in the utility industry, that's a terrific site for a data center, and we'll get you power to that site 7 years from now.
Wah, wah.
At which
Yeah.
point,
Yeah.
China will be so far beyond where we are. And so that simply cannot be the answer. We as a country, we as an energy community, we as a policymaking community cannot allow, we'll connect you in 7 years
Right.
to be the answer. And that is going to require a fundamental rethink to how we permit both new generation and new transmission to get that generation around our grids, and how we connect new large loads to the grid. It used to be just assumed. You could go into a jurisdiction and say, well, I've got a factory, I want to manufacture semiconductors, I want to put it in a data center, and they would have electricity for you.
Right.
That is no longer an assumption we can make. Just basic access to electricity, much less that it's low cost and it's reliable and it's carbon emissions free, is now in question in many parts of our country. And a big part of the stress in the system is because we've allowed our permitting regime to get really out of control in many cases. And it needs fundamental reform.
So we're just talking to Christina about how China's building out so quickly. So if we're talking 7 years, we're falling further and further behind, and that those months, days matter. Of course, this is a message you've been taking up to Capitol Hill. We saw a permitting package get close last year. What are you hoping for in terms of speed and a timeline for permitting this time around?
Well, it's funny that you lead with speed, right? Because, of course, that's the name of the great piece of legislation that Chair Westerman has introduced with Congressman Golden as well, so it's really exciting to see a bipartisan piece of legislation in there. I see he's over there now, so I am going to thank Representative Scott Peters for all of his leadership in bringing this on as well. I think we have a real opportunity right now. This is complicated because it involves at least 2 committees of jurisdiction in at least each chamber of commerce. This is energy policy, so this is real policy. This requires 60 votes in the Senate, and ideally it is also a robustly bipartisan package in the House. And it's complicated, and we've got a limited amount of time to do it while the stars align right now. There were terrific pieces from that legislation that got so close to the finish line last year, the Manchin-Barrasso legislation. In particular, things that we were very, very excited about that were many of the things that Christina just talked about in terms of getting that long-haul transmission up and running and finding a way to plan and permit and pay for that transmission. And we're also very excited about many of the pieces in the SPEED Act, particularly around the administration and speeding up the adjudication of statutes, both like the National Environmental Policy Act, like NEPA, and the whole host of other environmental permitting provisions that many of these projects have to go through. So, I mean, I think we have an opportunity right now to make significant progress on how these permits are administered, and ideally whether they're administered, because there's a whole lot of projects out there that require really complex, expensive permitting to get done that probably don't need that upfront permitting. Like, we probably should just let them build, because that project type in that kind of area has a really long, robust history of environmental compliance. So why are we requiring years of process up front to make it at all? Why not just let them build and then prove that they're complying? We have a real opportunity to reform the adjudication of all this. So for the stuff that does get permitted and that is subject to litigation, how do we radically shrink down the timelines for that adjudication while obviously still allowing folks in the public or in other parties that are significantly impacted by the project their day and their say? And then how do we make sure that the transmission system to tie all this together both to connect our new load into the system and to connect new generation. We've got a real opportunity right now to reform all those things.
You've outlined a lot of pieces there. Kind of start thinking about politically. Who likes that? Who doesn't like that? What are the ties that bind?
Well, this has got to be a big tent package. This has got to be. This has to have something for everyone. Personally, I think it's going to go well beyond energy. I think to have a big enough tent to drive all this forward. I mean, the most likely vehicle is obviously next year's highway bill. So I would assume that many of these reforms are not just going to apply to all the stuff that we energy nerds in the room, spend all of our time thinking about, but it's also going to apply to, roads and bridges and canals and everything else in the real world that I often drive across, but I don't really understand how that is built. But I'm very glad that it is. We're also I assume that there'll have to be significant pieces on other parts of the natural resources environment. So things like the Rosemont fix in the mining community. The pipeline community has a number of specific fixes. And I say pipeline very broadly. I think that's pipeline for liquid fuels. I think that's pipeline for CO2 that's captured from sites and taken and put underground. So one of these things is going to have something for the entire community in order to build enough momentum to get it going. The other thing I do think we should think about, though, is we've been really obsessed with the idea that we've got one big shot at this, and I think maybe to get this started, to make the breakthrough that really gets really significant federal permitting started, we've got a big shot in this Congress. But we should also realize that once we get started on doing this, the appetite for making further reforms is going to improve. The snowball
bold statement there.
I think we're going to pass a permitting reform bill every Congress for the next 10 once we get this started in a big way. So even if someone doesn't get their specific thing in this time around, just like as we've worked together for a decade on the innovation agenda, folks always said, well, you can't do that because you have to wait for the mega package. It was incremental legislation that then gradually built into larger and larger things that culminated in the bipartisan infrastructure law and other things. So.
Well, that's a bold statement. So maybe next time, sometime you can tell people, but let's start a culture of winning, getting things done, maybe? Is that?
Wouldn't that be great?
What?
That'd be great. That'd be great.
Oh, wait a minute. So, and then just a few seconds here left. Anything this audience needs to know? What's the call to action that you've got?
I will just go back to that urgent priority. It is really a matter of weeks and months and years here. We have to seize this opportunity to build fast, and we have to do it in a way where not every single major infrastructure decision made in this country, new generation or whatever, has all of these choke points and decision points. We just have to get as close as we can toward high compliance, but sort of upfront permissionless building for as many of these projects as possible if we have any hope of actually building enough to be competitive with China and of winning this incredibly vital race for our economy and certainly for our national security.
Well, join me in thanking Rich Powell and his wonderful insights he shared with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.